Okay, what I'd like to start off with is just for a few minutes, because I realized at the end of the last class I kind of went quickly over a very fundamental issue. Okay, when I said that what the defense does, it draws upon the whole of human history to show how our relationship with goods, our relationship to things, is always symbolic. That is, there is no such thing as human experience without a dimension of meaning to it. I saw some puzzled looks. So I just want to go over that a little bit clearer. What that means is, okay, this is what is fundamental. That is, our relationship when we relate to things. It's actually just not just things. When we relate to the world, so we're talking here about advertising in particular, and advertising talks about things. When we relate to things, we relate to them on two different levels. In analytically, we can separate them. In practice, you can't separate them out. In practice, that is, there is what goods do. If it's a pen, there is what goods do. That is, this pen, its utility. It writes. And then there is what my use of it means. And there is always a meaning to whatever our interaction with objects is. Now, it may seem difficult for you to figure out, like, what's the meaning of me using this pen? Well, imagine if instead of this pen being, a cheap UMass pen, if in fact it was a really expensive, $500 pen. If that makes a difference, if the fact that it suddenly became, what's a high level? What's a brand for a high level pen? Cross. Well, any one of those. If there's one of those, and you knew what it was, the meaning of my use of this thing changes. Which means the fact that you don't know about it doesn't mean that there is no meaning. It just means that that it's not highlighted. But if it makes a difference, what this pen is, then it means that even the use of this pen is symbolic. It means the symbolism is, actually it doesn't mean very much. The symbolism is not status. The symbolism is actually just an ordinary pen. That's the meaning of it. If it was a more expensive pen, it would mean something different. If that difference, right, it's a pen, does the same thing. I'm sure it does it equally well. But if what makes a difference is that additional meaning, then that is a function of every single interaction that we have. Meaning is always there, even if it doesn't seem it's there, even though we don't think, oh, this is what the meaning is, this is what even though we don't think about that consciously, that aspect of symbolism, that symbolic aspect is always there. And remember, the way to figure that out is, would it make a difference if there's something else? And if the answer to that is yes, then there is always a symbolic dimension to it. It's what the anthropologists call, this is the fancy term they use. Actually, let me just get this off the board for a second. Okay, it's what the anthropologists call the symbolic constitution of utility. Right? Utility, that's what we use. That's the way we use these products. That's their material. And then there is always a symbolic constitution to it. There's always what it means. And that is what advertising, that's what the defenders of advertising recognize. They say, look, there's always a symbolic dimension to how we use things. So if advertising doesn't lie, what's wrong with it? Right, it's a very powerful argument. And what I wanted to say was actually, yes, that first part of the argument is absolutely true. But the second part of the argument from anthropology would be that actually, yes, it's true, but that the control of symbolism is always linked up to social power. It is used, again, symbolism doesn't just fall from heaven fully formed. The meaning of anything is in fact given by human beings. And we saw that I try to make the example we used of diamonds, to show that the meaning of diamonds is, forever and, whatever. That didn't come fully formed from heaven. It didn't even come very far back in history. And every idea that we have, every symbolic dimension of our lives is made by someone. Someone comes up with it, someone creates it, someone has control of it, someone tells that story. And so just saying it's always symbolic, so that, stop complaining about it, is not enough. The next part of it, if it is always symbolic, well, who controls the symbolism for what ends? Who controls the stories for what ends? Because if you can control the stories of a culture, you can control that symbolic dimension, then you actually have total control. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius was once asked, someone said to him, what would you do if you were ever to run the state? That is, if you were in charge, if you were to rule the state, what would you do? And he gave a very interesting answer. He said he would, quote, rectify the language. What he meant by that was he would control the language. If he was asked today, he would say, give me control of the media. And if I can control the stories that people understand the world through, then you don't need to have police on street corners or the police to maintain power. You can imprison people in their own imaginations. You can imprison people in their own heads. That's the power of language. That's the power of symbolism. That's the power of storytelling. Depending upon who tells a story and what that story is, you can, in fact, control how people think about the world. So whenever you think about symbolism, you can't help but also ask, okay, whose symbolism? For what end? For what effect? Who controls? Those are actually the interesting questions to come out of it. And what I want to do is I want to take that insight that is developed from the defense, and I want to marry that with the very interesting set of questions that the critics ask about how is advertising connected to social power? How is it connected to these broader structures? And let me give you another example of what we mean by symbolism. How there's always a symbolic dimension to how we interact with the world, and that this is actually very cultural specific. Now let's think about food. Okay, food. People say, well, what's symbolic about food? People get hungry, you eat, etc. Well, actually, one of the things we know is that people won't just eat anything. Even when people are starving, when they've been shipwrecked or there's been some kind of air crash, and the only way they can stay alive is by eating their other passengers who may have died. We know that people, in fact, won't do what it will take to keep them alive. Because in their minds there is something, in their symbolism, in the stories in their mind, there is something wrong with eating other people. And even if it means that this body is going to die, they won't do it. Look at the ways in which different animals are treated in different cultures. Okay, in this culture, it'd be very difficult to think about feeding, using, for example, horses as food. We think about them as food for something else, but in other cultures, people eat horses. In other cultures, people eat dogs. People eat cats. There's nothing that's a symbolic dimension. In this, we will not eat it because it does. In this context, it means something different. And again, the more domesticated. That's why, the more domesticated something is. That's why we don't eat dogs, because dogs are considered to be part of the family. And just the same way you don't eat other members of your family, you don't eat dogs. Well, in other cultures, dogs are not members of the family. Dogs are treated very differently. Therefore, you have a different relationship to them. It's not just as a fluffy little pet. It's also it might be a pet, but you also have a domestic relationship to them as food. So that's what that means. The symbolic dimension of utility. There's always a symbolic dimension. And what we have to figure out is, how is it used? By whom? For what end? If you only say that everything is symbolic, and as long as advertising doesn't lie, it's okay. It actually asks less. It gets at less than half of what's really interesting about that statement. Okay, so I want to clarify that. This is the way to think about it. Is it okay? Whatever use of your product, if you can imagine that product that it being a different type of product with a different meaning, and if it makes a difference, then even though you don't think there is any symbolism to using this pen, there is. If it makes a difference, then that symbolic dimension is always, in fact, a part of it. And what I'm interested in doing is getting from that key insight to the question of how it is used. And we'll ask later on in the semester some very, very specific questions. it's not just abstract questions of power. It's like, what does the way, in terms of how symbolism is controlled, what does that do to things like the environment? How is global warming connected to the control of symbolism? How is our own personal debt, how much money we owe, connected to the stories that are circulating in our head about what objects are supposed to mean? So the effects of this are very, very concrete. Now, how do we? So what I've laid out, what we've done so far is we've laid out a series of arguments. I mean, we've done, I've kind of said, why should we study it? I've given some examples of it. Then we've looked in the last 3 classes at all the different arguments around the institution of advertising. Again, I want to stress again, that does not exhaust the criticism. If we wanted to, or the defense of it, we could look at that from a whole range of different dimensions. For example, it's not a matter of being, liberal or conservative. It's not that liberals don't like advertising and conservatives do. There's a lot of conservatives, in fact, who detest advertising because of what is in advertising. They think that advertising focuses too much on sexuality and the body, and that this is somehow immoral. At the same time, there are left-wing liberal critics of advertising who also would actually also from that come from, not from the same perspective, but also say, actually, yes, the stories around sexuality, in fact, are very negative. Now, we haven't even looked at that. That's not something we're examining right now. But there's a whole range of different arguments that can be made once we start looking at the content of it. And we'll do some of that later on. What we're interested in right now is looking at the specifics of the institution. Not of individual messages, but of the institution. Now, what we're going to do today, actually for the next 3 classes, is we're going to go back and we're going to do some history. Again, if you want to understand the present, you've got to go back and figure out and understand why it was put in place in the past. So studying history is not some abstract thing to do for its own sake. There is reason to do it for that that reason. But to understand the present, we also have to go back into the past. So I want to look at the key historical period in American society that led to the rise of advertising. And especially, the rise of advertising is rooted in some fundamental changes taking place in American culture, in the United States, in the period from 1850 to 1920. Okay, this is the transition of America from essentially an agricultural rural society to an urban-centered society. That's the transition we're looking at, and it happens sometime in that period. And what I want to stress also is that this is, I want to stress the necessity of advertising developing within those changes. Advertising doesn't develop because some brilliant individual came up with this idea, and if that individual didn't exist, there wouldn't be advertising. Okay, advertising, the way we have to think about advertising is structurally, that it plays a structural role in the society, in the economy, in the culture. And that, in fact, the reason advertising arises, and in fact the reason it looks like it does at the present time, is because of the way in which the society is organized. It fulfills, in fact, a very, very specific function. And it's not and that's to do with broader structural issues, not individual people saying, I think we should advertise. And not being based on any kind of individual creativity. It's actually to do with structures. Now, to understand that, what we're going to look at, this is the layout, the things we're going to look at today. This economic and social history. You'll need the handout. I hope everyone brought it with them. The social and economic roots of the consumer culture. Okay, we're going to look at. Okay, so let's see how I can pick this up. We're going to look at this. We're going to look at the changes from 3 perspectives. Good. Firstly, economic transformation. Secondly, business strategy. And then thirdly, as advertising as solving the social crisis of industrialization. So I'm just laying that out. We're going to look at those 3 major changes that are going on. Let's start with, we're going to look at the rise of advertising. Let's look at the situation before there was advertising. and try and understand America actually in the middle of the 19th century, around about 1850. And again, most of the stuff we're looking at today, when we look historically in these ways, it very rarely is it specific to individual years. We're talking about broad changes that are taking place in America around this time, in the middle of the 19th century. We have to remember, okay, if we would ask the very basic question, what were the conditions? So let's start off with economic questions. If we were to ask some basic questions about what life looked at this time, we'd have to remember that America pre-1850 is a largely rural society. At that time, 80% of the population is rural, lived in rural areas, involved in rural agricultural pursuits, that is, working the land in various ways. As such, they produced, if you're working on the farm, working on the land, you actually have a limited relationship to objects because you produce much of what you need yourself. You're growing food yourself, you're largely self-sufficient. So in fact, there is very little interaction at this point with the market. And the market is that place where people come together to buy and sell. So when you can essentially produce what you need to live yourself, then your relationship to the market is relatively minor. And at this time, in fact, there is very little industry in the culture. There is very little industry in the society. What industry there was that existed, we wouldn't actually recognize today. What the industry there was largely processing natural resources and agricultural produce into materials that consumers themselves would use to make their own things. So the leading industries of this time are things like flour and grain milling. So people actually perhaps would buy flour and grain and make their own bread. They are lumber and sawmilling, where people would get lumber and would make it, that would build their own buildings, or textiles, where people would take textiles and then make their own clothes. So those are the major industries are resource extractive industries at this time. These are the kind of things that people bought in the marketplace. They didn't go in, they didn't go in and ask for a particular kind of brand, because in fact these objects that people bought in the marketplace were largely unbranded. And we'll see how, again, we now think of brands as being natural. That when someone makes a product, then they automatically put their name on it. Well, wasn't always the case. In this transitional period, in this early period, in fact, there were no trademarks and no brands. Let's go to quote number 1 from the handout today. This is Daniel Pope, who's written the book on the development of advertising in this period, called The Making of Modern Advertising. He says, "In this stage of economic development, there was little room for manufacturers to advertise their goods widely. It would be hard to conceive of developing a consumer allegiance to the flour of a particular local gristmill or the lumber of a particular sawmill." And the reason there wasn't there was no necessity to advertise was that the products that people interacted with, lumber, textiles, etc., they were mostly produced locally, and they were for local consumption. So people actually knew where the goods were coming from. People knew that they were actually produced in the same vicinity, in the same locale. In fact, and for a long time, markets in the early years of capitalism, in the early years of industrialization, or the early years of this move towards a market economy, markets tended to be local. And the very simple reason for that was that there was no transportation system that existed at this time to get commodities from one place to another. And if you wanted to get them from one place to another, it actually cost a lot of money. Because actually at this point there is no rail system, there is nothing that makes hauling goods cheap. And so goods are produced and then sold locally, and therefore consumption is local. As such, people had pretty first-hand knowledge of where their products came from. They knew the lumber mill it came from, they knew the people who make, where the textiles were coming from, etc. They knew the farm that the flour was coming from, or the mill the flour was coming from. There was actually little reason, for this reason, there was little reason to advertise. Now there were some goods that came in. Okay, so very little advertising. Very little advertising. Now there was some advertising, and this actually is, we're getting to an interesting kind of transitional phase. There were some goods that did actually come from outside, because not everything was available, not everything that was needed was there in the places that people lived. Things like hardware items, or things like salt or spices, things that you could not get in that area. Some of those things did come into a local retailer. But even for that, there was actually little advertising. And the advertising there was, in fact, the bulk of the advertising before 1850, very important point, the bulk of the advertising before around 1850 is the advertising of retailers, is the advertising of shopkeepers, who are essentially announcing that goods have arrived from outside. And these ads are more like classified ads than what we would see today. And let's look at, this is from a paper called the Palmer Journal in Palmer, Massachusetts. And this is actually the front page, and this is what the front page used to look like. And it's actually, I'm going to come back to this page, because it's a very interesting page. Let's look on the left-hand side. Okay, so it says, that there's essentially a retailer called Chapman and French. Boys and men's and boys' clothing of every description for sale by Chapman and French. Sperm, oil, and linseed oils for sale at some prices by they're essentially announcing, look, you want clothing, we've got some. You want oil, we've got some. Flour, we've got some. Okay, come in. It's essentially an announcement of their availability. In that sense, it's not. We think about it more. We think about it more like classified advertising. Today's classified advertising. So the advertising that we now think of as normal, large-scale visuals, etc., simply doesn't exist. And as I said, it's what we're going to trace through. What we want to trace through is how did that develop? And why did it develop? Because again, there's nothing, when I said that there are broad movements in economy and culture that make this possible, there's nothing inevitable about that. There's no reason why advertising should have developed in that direction as opposed to some other direction. So there are broad changes taking place, but they are also created by human beings and by institutions that human beings have built. So the question then is, what changes this situation? Right? So before around the middle of the 19th century, our relationship to products is, just to sum up, they're unbranded, they're for local consumption, and there is very little advertising. And what advertising there is the advertising of retailers. Most of what people need, how people use objects, or how people use things was they produced it themselves. And sometimes they needed materials to produce those things, which they bought in the marketplace. Now, the question then is, what changes this situation? That's the key situation. How then do we emerge from this setting where objects are unbranded, where they're for local consumption, etc.? How do we emerge from that situation into something different? Broadly speaking, we're now looking at these economic changes, and I hope actually most of this is not new to you, because this is very basic social and economic history that we're going to look at today. There are three related developments. Firstly, there are advances in industrialization. That is, the ways in which people, this is now the development of industry, the development of the factory system, and people is now no longer just working on the land, but you're now actually working in factories with machinery to make objects for sale in the marketplace. And in the early years of the rise of industrialization, the most important thing to understand from our perspective, not from any perspective, but from the perspective that we're interested in, is that the investment at this time, in the mid-19th century, American industries expansion is built upon what is called capital-intensive investment. And I'm going to explain what this is in a second. Capital-intensive investment. For example, whereas before, if you wanted, let's say you were making shoes, the ways in which you would make shoes, or you'd hire some cobblers. and you would, and the labor of people would be how you make shoes. But it's a very inefficient way of making shoes. You can't make that many shoes. And so if you want to make more shoes, then you have to start, you have to buy machinery. Well, machines are expensive. Let's say you want to buy a machine to help you make shoes, and it costs $100,000. How do you get that? Well, most people don't have, even today, most businesses don't have that kind of money just lying around. What you do is you get a loan. You get a loan for $100,000. And of course you have to start paying it back straight away. Now the machines start to make more and more, the machines are very efficient. They start to make more and more products. However, unless someone buys those products, you are going to be in big trouble. Let's say, remember this is when Marx talked about the immense accumulation of commodities, this is the revolution of capitalism. You start producing all these things, and you can't, once you've made an investment in capital, once you've made that investment in machinery, this is what you can't say. You can't say, oh, things seem to be a little bit slow. We're not actually selling as many products as we thought we would do, so we're actually going to ease up on production. We're going to produce less. We're going to shut the machines down. Because if you say that, your payment is still due the next week and the next month. So idle, you don't have the option of saying, we'll just wait until things pick up again. Now, let me contrast capital-intensive investment with labor-intensive investment. If you invested heavily in labor, that is, if instead of a machine you had actually hired, 10 cobblers, and they were producing a lot of shoes, more shoes than you could sell, then you could say to those cobblers, because you haven't invested in them, you're just saying, well, I'm going to pay you this wage this week, and you haven't made any investment beyond that. You could say to them, actually, we're going to lay you off, because things are slow, and perhaps when they pick up again, we'll hire you back. And at that point, that's not costing you anything. You don't have to pay them if you lay them off. And so labor-intensive investment is different in that sense. But once you've invested in machinery, once you've invested a lot of money in machinery, then those machines have to keep running. It is a business necessity that those machines keep running. As such, and this is not just in one business, but this is a general trend. As such, there is actually a huge increase in the number of goods that are produced. This is the production of the immense collection of commodities. And it is driven, right? It is driven in the first hand, not because people want them, not because there is a huge demand for this, but because, in fact, that is the way in which American industry is organized. And that there is, in that sense, an internal necessity in the way in which investment happens to keep the machines running and to keep producing more and more things. Like, for example, let me give you one example, and this is very general across a whole range of industries. In 1890, for example, there were 32,000 pianos produced in the US. By 1904, that is 14 years later, there are 370,000 pianos being produced. That is, there is almost a tenfold increase in production within a period of 14 years. Well, how are you going to? What are you going to do? Remember, those products have to be sold. Unless they're sold, then you don't have money coming back in to keep investing in the machines. And if you don't sell what you've produced, you are going to go bankrupt. You are going to go broke because you've made this huge investment. So one way, what American industry needed at this time, it's a very rational way of thinking about it. What American industry needed this time was, in fact, they needed to get. Now, see, one solution from a societal viewpoint, you may say, actually, if you're producing too much, perhaps you should just cut back on that, and then you could put resources somewhere else. Well, when you're based on a system of private production, you don't have that option. And so, in fact, the problem is not that you're producing too much. The problem, of course, is the people aren't buying enough. And once you turn around that way, that is, in fact, the problem is not overproduction. The problem is underconsumption. Then the solution is very clear. You don't have to cut back. What you have to do is you have You need people to buy more. You need to, in fact, stimulate desire in people. You need to get people to buy more things. And that actually is exactly that. I mean, early advertisers realize this, early industrialists realize this. In the historical work that's been done, I mean, they talk explicitly about what they need to do and what advertising should be doing. For example, let's go to quote number 2. This is from an advertising expert called Emily Fogg Mead. This actually is the mother of the most famous anthropologist there was, Margaret Mead. This is her mother, who was an advertising person, who in 1901 said that, quote, this is quote 2, "We are not concerned with the ability to pay, but with the ability to want and choose, which means opening up imagination and emotion to desire." We don't really care if people can afford this or not. That's not. What we need to do is we need to open up imagination and emotion to desire. In fact, one of the people who wrote a history of department stores actually called his book "Land of Desire." Land of Desire. Another advertiser said, quote number 3. What about this? "Without imagination, no wants. Without wants, no demand to have them supplied." Which is a very, very succinct. Unless there is demand, then there is no reason to supply. So you've got to, and you notice the way the wording actually is very interesting. The wording isn't "let's tell people more about products." It's about imagination. It's about emotion. It's about desire. That's the way, it's the way advertisers started thinking from a relatively early time. So not right at the start, but we'll see how quickly they came about. Let's go to quote number 4. Okay, so in terms of, if you wanted to go back to the defense and the criticism, of this, there really isn't a lot of support for the defenders saying that the reason, you have the immense accumulation, the immense collection of commodities is because people needed it. That's not the way. The reason you have more and more products is because that is what industry needed, and then it required industry to try and stimulate desire in the population, in consumers, to try and match the supply they had. This is Benjamin Barber, who wrote a book just came out recently called Consumed, looking at this period, and he says, quote 4, "Here was the critical transition from capitalism as a production-based system, where saving was the leading virtue, to capitalism as a consumption-based system, where spending would become the leading virtue." Stop there for a second, right? The critical transition from a production-based system, where saving was the leading virtue, to capitalism as a consumption-based system. As a consumption-based system, where spending would become the leading virtue. The transition from a necessity-driven and static rural life to a mobile and urban discretionary culture of, and he's quoting someone else now, of the automobile and the airplane, motion pictures and radio, the electric light and appliances, bottled soft drinks and canned soups. That's the new society that was needed. He says, and this is summing up, he says, a transition, in other words, from a system that serviced wants to a system that produced wants. There's one thing to say, actually, here are the wants that exist, and we're now going to service them. To producing the wants that you're going to service. Okay, this is what Galbraith would call the revised sequence. Now remember, actually, some of the marketing people actually would actually acknowledge this. Remember, some of them actually said, actually, in the early years. There was too much of a focus on trying to sell what had been produced, on impact, and trying to create demand, trying to create desires. But remember, the marketing people said that changes sometime in the 20th century. So actually, I don't think there is on this point. I don't actually think there is a lot of debate between critics and defenders, because we're talking historically. Actually, we have people who've studied this historically. Now, to make that possible. So what you have to do is you have to stimulate desire. Well, I'll put it in more practical terms. If you're a manufacturer of shoes, for example, you've got to expand your market. If your market is largely, upper class people, you've got to expand your market downwards, so it's middle class people and working class people as well. And at the same time, so that's one way. Within the area that you live, can you expand your market vertically, from top to bottom, or whichever way you want to go on that. At the same time, why limit yourself to, if your factory is in Boston, why limit yourself to Boston? Can you expand your market also nationally? Can you expand your market so you're not just selling to people in Boston, you're selling to, in Chicago and Washington and Los Angeles perhaps a little bit later on? Can you expand your market? And that's called horizontal expansion. That's just what you have to do. Now, at this point, that may be what you want, but that is impossible to do. That is impossible to do unless there is, in fact, a communication and transportation system that makes possible getting your goods, getting what you produce, to somewhere else. And again, the second part of the development of these broad changes is changes in communication and transportation. Again, that's the one, the major hauling, getting commodities from one place to another is a major factor of how you expand markets. You have to have those mechanisms, and in fact the major mechanism, the major development of this, of course, is the development of the railway, which makes possible relatively cheap transportation of goods across the country. So now, in fact, manufacturers can think about expanding their market, the immense accumulation of commodities, in fact, by also trying to find markets elsewhere as well. That's the second development. And thirdly, there is the development of urbanization. That is, there are incredible movements of population at this time. As America is transitioning from a rural agricultural society to an urban industrial society, there are two twin movements of migration. First of all, from the European countryside into American cities. That's one movement. And of course, the movement from the American countryside into American cities. And so this is at the turn of the century, the 19th century to 20th century. I mean, the scale of migration is immense. The scale of how many people are actually, and what they're doing is they're actually going from one style of living, one way of living. It's not a style. It's a way of living. That is on the land, working farms, etc., making things for yourself. They're going from that to a situation in which they are going to work in factories producing things for someone else, for which they will get wages in return. It's a very, very different way of thinking about how to live. The movements of population are also, in fact, they're also indicative of huge transformations in how people are living. For example, in 1860, we're still in the 19th century, in 1860 about 80% of the population is rural, as I mentioned. By 1900, which is 40 years later, only 50% of the population is rural. Now, within historical terms, that's a blink of an eye. 40 years is a blink of an eye to have those kinds of transitions taking place. And of course, that figure of how many people are involved in agricultural pursuits goes down and down and down and down. To today, where it is virtually zero. Because even the people who are working on the land, working it not for themselves. There are some farmers who still work for themselves, but the vast amount of even agricultural work is you work for someone else. You're producing food in what's called agribusiness, in an industrial setting, industrial mode, for someone else. So you're getting wages rather than producing it for yourself. Again, that's the movement from rural to urban. From rural to industrialization is one of these key movements. Urbanization then, and what this does is you now have, of course, if that's the case, you now have, instead of people making goods themselves, growing their own food, making their own clothes, etc. Instead of that, you now are in a situation where people are working for long hours in a factory. And when we're talking long, we're not talking 8 hours. We're talking actually 12 hours and even more. I mean, the early experiences of the factory are very, very difficult. They're very, very hard for the new workers who are coming in. So you work for 12, 14 hours, you get wages for that. You don't have time now to be able to, you don't have time or what's called the means of production to grow your own food or to make your own clothes, or you don't have the time and you don't have the resources. So you now become a new market. You become a market for products. So new markets are created. Let me give you one example. Let's take a very staple commodity. Let's take something like bread, which was a staple of the diet during this time. In 1850, at the start of this transition, only 10% of bread is baked commercially. That is, of all the bread that is consumed, only 10% of it is bought in the marketplace. That is, you go somewhere and you buy a loaf of bread that someone else has produced. Well, by 1900, that figure is up to 25%. And by 1930, that figure is up to 60%. Now, those figures actually tell us a way in which, if you can generalize them, they tell us the ways in which the market has become more and more important. In 1860, relatively unimportant. By 1930, by 1900, much more important. That is, people are now they're now going to the market as consumers, using the wages that they get from working in industry to buy the products, to buy what they need, in fact, to survive. Now this creates new products, so new markets for goods. So all these change, those are the three. You got industrialization, you got developments in communication and transportation, and you got developments in urbanization that are revolutionizing what American society looks like. Okay, these are broad changes. They don't happen overnight. And so we're talking about 50 years, 60 years in which these are happening. But but as I said, 50, 60 years in historical terms is the blink of an eye when we're talking about these kinds of changes. Let's go to quote number 5, where I've given you some. You can see then that there is actually, there is some relationship between expenditures on advertising. That is the middle figure. You see, in 1880, there's $200 million spent on advertising. By 1916, that is up to like 1.4 billion. And on the next column over is GNP, gross national product. That's an indication of how much is being produced in the society and how much economic activity there is. And you can see as that goes up from 13.1 billion in 1890 to 49, advertising goes along with it. Now, the question are they causal? Are those figures causal? That is, advertising leads to greater GNP, or in fact, does greater GNP lead to more advertising? That I'm not arguing right now, even though some of the evidence we've looked at indicates that in fact advertising plays a key role in stimulating demand, which is key then to producing more things. But at the very least, what this tells us is that there is a correlation, that advertising and the growth of industrial society is linked in some way. Now, hopefully what I've just said is not actually anything new to you. I hope that's basic social and economic history that you should have done at least in high school, and in terms of understanding what's happening understanding what's happening in transformations in the culture. The next thing I want to look at is business strategy, and this actually is not often looked at. What I've given you so far is a standard kind of view that you'd find in most marketing textbooks. And what I want to stress, what I want to now look at is, how do we go from that situation where goods are, remember the pre-situation, which is goods are unbranded, right? They do not have trademarks. They are just, it's just flour, it's just crackers, it's just lumber, it's whatever. How do we go from that to a situation in which products come to be explicitly connected to the people who make them? And they are, in fact, they are then differentiated. They are distinguished from other producers of the similar kind of product. That is, how do we get to that situation? Well, to understand that, we have to understand, this is maybe a little more complicated, we have to understand how the marketplace functions. Okay, in general, you have to understand, 4 major actors within the marketplace. On the one hand, so we're going to look at the situation where before, like in the early years of industrialization. On the one hand, you have manufacturers. Okay, you have people who make things. In a moment, we'll call them A, B, and C. They're the people who make products. Now, those are the people who, whether they're shoes or whatever else they're doing, clothing, those are the people who now have a need because of capital-intensive investment and because of the development of communications and transportation, because new markets are being created through urbanization. Those are the people who have a need to expand to national markets. How do you expand to a national market? How do you get your product out to, if you're in Boston, how do you get it out to Chicago? Well, if you were to just do it yourself, it'd be way, way too expensive. If you have to figure out how not only to produce it, but how to get it to another market and how to get it into stores so that people could buy it, you simply couldn't do that. It would be too much investment. So you're looking for specialized people who will help you get your product out there, who will help you. And that's the second part. The second actors in this are wholesalers. Now what wholesalers do is they take stuff that's produced by someone else and they act as middlemen and say, okay, we're going to get your product to retailers. So wholesalers, they buy from manufacturers and they mark up and they sell then to retailers. They then get they get those products out into shops. They get it out into stores. And that's a very specialized task, this task of wholesaling. It's a task of distribution. Manufacturers are not experts in distribution. Manufacturers are experts in manufacturing. And what American industry needs at this time, or what the marketplace needs, at this time, is an additional expertise. That is, people who are experts in distribution, who then get it out to retailers, into shops, and once they're in shops, then consumers can have access to them in the marketplace. Okay, so you've got to be able to understand these 4 manufacturers, people who make things, wholesalers, people who distribute things, retailers, people who sell things, and consumers, people who buy things. Okay, it's a basic way any market economy works. Now, at this time, remember, where is the advertising? The advertising is, remember, at this time, from retailers. Retailers are announcing the arrival of goods. Yes, we have flour has come in. A barrel of crackers has come in. Clothing has come in, as we saw from before. That is where most of the advertising is. Now, in this situation, where does market power lie? That's the question, because there's always power that operates in anything. Who holds market power in this situation? Well, remember, the major thing I haven't told you, or the major thing I want to stress, is that manufacturer A, B, and C don't have any trademarks yet. What they do is they produce shoes, they produce whatever it is. They have not made any kind of trade, they have not distinguished their product from anything else. So at this time, market power actually lay with the wholesaler. And this is why. Market power lay here because this is what would happen. A retailer would say to a wholesaler from where they get all their products, they would say, okay, I need this many pounds of crackers. That's always the object that's used. The cracker barrel. There's a barrel and there were crackers in there. That was one of these early products. They would say, I need this many pounds of crackers. And the wholesaler would then go to, he'd say, well, actually, I know three different places where I can get crackers. 3 different places. And he would go to them and he would say, okay, I need the cheapest price. And he would play off, or the wholesaler, he or she, would play off manufacturers against each other based on price. Because all the wholesaler has to provide for the retailer is not, it has to be of a minimal quality. But there's very little other distinguishing aspects right now. All the wholesaler has to produce is crackers. And so he would play off manufacturer A, B, and C against each other based on price. Now remember, let me do one. Remember, most of the advertising is done here. Most of the advertising is announcement of the arrival of whatever goods there are in the marketplace. So we can say before advertising, in this period, the major competition in the marketplace was price competition. Now, okay, put yourself now in the position. So let's put yourself in the position of a manufacturer. Okay, you need the wholesalers because without them you can't get your product out. You can't bypass them. You need the wholesalers. But your profit margins are absolutely rock bottom because you are the victim of competition. Because you can't just say to a wholesaler, this is the cost of it, and if you don't like it, go somewhere else. Because they will go somewhere else. Because what they have to do is they don't need your product in particular. They just need crackers. And so you are constantly there's constant price competition. And you are having to sell to wholesalers at lower and lower costs. So market parity, and then wholesalers, once they bought low, they can then sell to retailers at a higher price. And the market power lies with them. And remember, at this time, retailers did most of the advertising. Now, let me put you in the position of those manufacturers. Your profit margins have been driven down and down and down. From your self-interest, how do you respond? How do you get your profits back up? Yeah.
Try to persuade people that mind. Creating some kind of a symbol that attaches to my craft.
Okay. So the answer is you try and persuade which people are you? Sorry, which people are you?
The wholesale. The consumer.
Right. Actually, if you can persuade consumers, that's the answer. If you can persuade consumers to go into a store and ask not for just crackers, but for a particular brand of crackers, then the retailer is saying to the wholesaler, not just I need some crackers, but I need this particular kind. And if the wholesaler says that, then in fact they can only go to one seller. Instead of going to 3 different sellers and playing them off each other. The wholesaler may say to the retailer, look, this other one is just as good. You can just. But if the retailer says, no, my customers are coming in and they want this thing, then you are being forced to go to one manufacturer. And that actually is exactly what happens. This is the situation after advertising. Advertising is used by manufacturers to go directly to consumers, and consumers, to the extent that you can get consumers to go in and ask for something in the market, in stores from retailers, then retailers will request that from wholesalers, and they will only be able to buy from one thing. How do you do that? Well, you have to distinguish your crackers from someone else's. You have to distinguish your product from someone else. How do you do that? Well, you do that by giving it a name, by putting a trademark on it, by putting a brand on it, and then advertising that directly to consumers. So, in fact, advertising starts now to become not the advertising of retailers, which it was before, but the advertising of manufacturers in an attempt to make their product mean something different within the marketplace. Actually, if you want to see this, remember that the front page I looked at before. Sorry. So in this instance, a market power shifts. Market power shifts the manufacturers from wholesalers, and advertising is a key component in how that market power shifts. Now, if you actually want to see this, I actually think the most interesting times to look at history, is times of transition, when things are changing from one to another. Because when things are fully completed, you don't realize how things have developed. So in fact, transitional periods are absolutely key. In fact, let's go back to where we were here. Okay, this is that front page. This is the page in the Palmer Journal we looked at from the 19th century. And instead of looking at the left side, look at the right side. Okay, this is an advertising for what are called patent medicines. And patent medicines were, if you've heard of something called the snake oil salesman, if you heard that term, well, snake oil, the salesmen were people who went from town to town selling these remedies, what they call patent medicines. They're patent medicines because only they had them. They were patented, and they were only with this person who was selling. And so they would go around trying to sell these worthless things. And they would make all kinds of arguments. Well, now, if you read it, that's what it says. Okay, important announcements. The king of painkillers in a new dress. The only sovereign and never failing remedy for subduing pain and curing the worst. Okay, this is what it can now cure. The worst burns, scalds, piles, cuts, wounds, bruises, rheumatism, and all cutaneous and inflammatory diseases. And cure all of that stuff. Right? And then it's not just this is some generic product. This is Daly's magical pain extractor in a new dress and boxes of much enlarged use. And then he says, caution. Okay, caution. Counterfeits in the old wrappers flood the market. Avoid them as you would poison. Right? Don't be taken in by other people saying this. This is only Daly's who can do this. This is with Daly's is different to what else is out there. So in fact, here you can see the old society. You can see the old, which is on the left-hand side, which is the advertising of retailers saying, okay, the goods are here, come and get them. To the new society that is emerging on the right-hand side, which in fact is a society which is with the advertising of persuasion. Okay, just look at the difference in language. Okay, this is on the left side it's available. On the right side it's actually closer to what we would now think of as modern advertising. It's persuasive, and it is driven by trademarks. It is driven by brands. It is Daly's. Don't buy this. Don't buy someone else's. And in fact, it's not surprising then that many of the early advertisers, many of the early people who were doing advertising, in fact, were patent medicine salesmen. They were people who actually had learned how to distinguish their products from other people, from other products. They had learned how to persuade in this way. So as I said, this is, for me, it's always a really this transitional period where you can look at a document, you can look at one document and see the old society that is passing and the new society that is actually emerging, even as you're reading it. Again, this is a general. So as advertising is used in this way, and essentially what advertising does is contributes to competition in the marketplace, going away from pricing. Advertising now, because the new advertising, when manufacturers start to brand their products and to advertise them, okay, it is not we're the cheapest. It is not look we're the best. We're the most modern. We're the whatever else however else you want to argue it. So in fact, the arguments you're making are not around price. They're around brand loyalty. Be loyal to this brand. And so branding actually is key to competition, to market competition moving away from price at the same time. And once you can do that, then manufacturers are no longer competing with each other on the basis of price. They're competing with each other on they're competing with each other on the basis of imagination. They're competing with each other on the basis of the ability to create desires, on the ability to forge some kind of emotional link with consumers. And competition and price competition essentially disappears at that time. So that's the second part. That's the second reason. The third aspect, the third major change I want to look at is, and we've looked at some of this already, this is called the social crisis of industrialization. that advertising actually, that the early years of industrialization, in fact, cause a major crisis. There is a major crisis. The author connected to this is an author called Stuart Ewan, who wrote, I mentioned before, he wrote one of the first books on it called Captains of Consciousness. And he argues that advertising, that the term social crisis of industrialization is Ewan's term. Okay, that's the term that he uses to describe. So he's one of our best social historians, one of the first people to really take consumption seriously as an object of study for historians. So actually consumption wasn't taken very seriously as an object of study by historians. And he argues that advertising arises as a response to what he calls the social crisis of industrialization. What is the social crisis? Well, on the one hand, okay, we're familiar with this. This is a crisis of consumption. People simply are not buying enough. Right? It's a crisis of underconsumption. We've looked at this already. Okay? Caused by too many objects caused by the production of the immense collection of things, immense collection of commodities. The people would have to be socialized into buying them. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because we've already dealt with that. But Ewan argues, so there's that one. That's a very serious crisis. You don't solve that. The society is dead. The economy is dead. If you don't solve that problem, but he says there is an equally urgent problem in the realm of production. Because industrialization, that is people working in factories, moving from the land, working in factories, was more than just producing goods in a new way. It involved, in fact, a whole new process of how goods were being produced. It involved the whole process of socialization into new ways of producing goods. And in fact, in the early years of industrialization, if you come from the rhythms of the land, that is what's important in terms of how you operate, how you work on a daily basis in terms of the sun going up and then the sun going down, and this is the rhythms of the season and the rhythms of, I don't want to over-romanticize it, the rural living is really tough living. I mean, people are on the edge of starvation a lot of the time. But the rhythms that determine the rural living are very different. They're the rhythms of nature. Well, in the factory, what you're governed by is not nature. You're governed by the time clock. You're governed by this clock that says your work starts now and it ends 14 hours later. In fact, there's a very interesting essay written by another social historian called E.P. Thompson about what the work clock means as a new mode of socialization. That you have to socialize people into a different way of thinking about themselves and what they do in terms of production. As I said, the time clock replaces nature. And in that sense, this is a fundamental shift in the way in which people lived and worked and thought about the world. This isn't just always a new way of doing it. It is a revolutionary way of doing it. And in fact, the early years of industrialization, the early years of capitalist industrialization, they're not some kind of smooth, functioning system, as some of the history books may tell us. In fact, what is central to this early factory production and to early factory experience is working class resistance to the factory. This is a time of intense conflict between workers and people who own factories, in which workers are trying to do as little as possible and trying to have as much control of their lives, and capitalists are trying to get them to do as much as possible for the least amount of wages. And this is not some harmonious period of, well, I have this labor to sell and you have labor to buy, and this is a period of intense conflict. It's a period of intense class conflict. And Ewan argues, and much of this resistance, Ewan argues, is not just about the way the people want more wages. Much of this resistance is about the nature of industrial capitalism itself. It's about the nature of factory work itself. It's about the nature of its dehumanizing qualities, the nature of its alienating qualities, where people become just a cog in the machine. Again, I was going to play a little clip from, if you want to, Charlie Chaplin actually did a really interesting, Charlie Chaplin, the great comedian, his great film was called Modern Times. And if you can actually, you can look at it on YouTube. You can find it easily on YouTube, and we'll watch the clip. And it's about how, in fact, workers get integrated into the system of production as nothing more than machines. They become simply cogs in the machine, and they actually start to change their own nature as a result. So as a result, the early years of industrial capitalism are periods of intense working class resistance to the factory. And the way it's solved in the early 20th century, the way this is solved in one way is through force, in which capitalists use the police to break down unions, to break down working class resistance. So this is a period of intense class conflict. Now, a crisis in one of these areas, right, a crisis in consumption is enough to make sure the society is not going to survive. A crisis in production by itself will be an equally severe crisis. Capitalism at this point is faced with a crisis in both its major realms, both in how the immense collection of things are produced, and also in how you're going to sell the immense collection of things. How you're going to, I mean, as I said, unless you can solve both of these problems, you can't just solve one. You have to solve both. And Ewan argues that advertising would solve both problems simultaneously. That was its genius. It would solve both problems by one. We've looked at this before. It would create desires in people to buy the immense collection of commodities. And secondly, it would redefine the identity of workers as consumers. That is, if advertising can, through its stories, be able to convince people that they should really think of themselves not as workers essentially, but as consumers, then work simply becomes a means to another end. And people won't struggle about it so much. Then it's just, well, you've got to put up with work to get what we need, which is money so that we can really be consumers. This is, if you go back to the critics, of course, this is the last part of that argument, which is advertising as a form of social control, advertising as a form of ideology and social control. But again, at this point, it's absolutely fundamental. You've got to be able to you've got to be able to distract people from their role as producers and get them essentially to go along with whatever happens in the world of production, so that they can actualize themselves as consumers. If you can do that, if advertising could do that, you could solve both problems. You've solved the problem of consumption, and you've solved the problem of conflict in the world of production as well. You've solved the social crisis of industrialization. Let's go to quote number 4 as a summing up. This is from a book by William Lease and some others called Social Communication and Advertising. They say, quote 6, summing this up, a century ago in North America and Western Europe, the forms of privileged discourse that touched the lives of ordinary persons were church sermons, political oratory, and the words and precepts of family elders. Okay, that's before, that's the old time. Such influences remain with us, but their prominence within the affairs of everyday life and the rhetorical force and moral authority that they carry are sharply diminished. The space left as these influences have diminished has been filled largely by, you remember this phrase now, it's been filled largely by the discourse through and about objects. So those old institutions of meaning, of symbolism, family, community, religion, they've become much, much less important. And into that void, and as we move from one type of society to another, and into that void has come advertising. And so it's now the stories of advertising that now influence how we think about ourselves. Well, that movement is no accident. It is not individual creation, but it comes out of the movements of history. Okay, what we'll look at next time is how the industry arose as a response to this.